some time and write down your notes, a time of crisis and compromise in the United States, and the first subtopic is going to be the issue of slavery. Now, if you're taking the William Fields note-taking class, he doesn't have to write that down because it's already on his sheet. He's just going to fill in here, right?
That's what he should do.
Well, yeah, it's prelude to Civil War. When we come back from Christmas vacation, that's what we'll be into, is the Civil War, okay? Now, in the South, the city of New Orleans was considered ground zero for the slave trade. At this time in history, in the South, the city of New Orleans was considered ground zero for the slave trade. What does that mean, if it's ground zero? Colt?
That's where all that goes on.
That's where all of it basically goes on for the most part. Ground zero is where everything happens.
Where it all started out.
Where it all started, where it all originated, where the hub is. So the hub of the entire slave trade in the South at this time was in the city of New Orleans. That's where it all happened.
Does that have New Orleans in Mississippi too?
Exactly. You'll see some examples of that. Now listen to this. They figured in the South that the slave trade alone was worth $2 billion in today's dollars to the economy. The economy of the South, the richness of the South at this time, $2 billion in today's money is what the slave trade brought into the southern part of the United States. It's a lot of money. So it was a big time economic advantage for the South, the slave trade. And where was ground zero for this? Where did it all focus in on? New Orleans. Now let me give you a little bit. We're talking about 1840. 1840. I'll tell you what slaves sold for. This is what a slave sold for in 1840. A male slave sold for approximately $1,000 in 1840, which would be about $28,000 today. So if you went and bought yourself a good slave in 1840, it cost a male. It would cost a male adult. It would cost you about $1,000, about $28,000 in today's figures. Okay. If you went and bought yourself a good female slave in 1840, you'd pay about $800, which would be about $23,000 in today's monies.
Aren't they worth once because they're medical?
Well, that's the that was the idea. Now, for those of you that think that children weren't slaves, you've heard the expression child labor. That's not true. Children, males and females, sold for approximately $500 apiece, or about $14,000 in today's monies. So can you see how a
14,000.
Can you see how a sharecropper or a plantation owner could invest some serious money in slave work?
Yeah.
It was a big, big business. So again, 1840, males, approximately $1,000, which would be approximately $28,000 in today's money. Females, approximately $800, about $23,000 in today's money. And children went for about $500, or about $14,000 in today's money. Now I want you to picture this as people went to slave auctions. You've heard of slave auctions like FFA. I used to have one. Wasn't probably the political thing to say is have a slave auction. They actually auctioned off these slaves, just like they were cars. What?
Kind of like the livestock auction, they bring them up, point
Yeah,
out like
well,
$1,000.
good point. I'm going to give you some things that they did to the slaves prior to purchase. They were evaluated, as you said, Colt, like prize animals. Yeah.
So if someone bought like a child and then kept it until it was older, that would be saved because it's not. You saved like $500.
You'd make more money because if you sold it when they were adults, you'd make more money. Yeah, no question. It was definitely a trade. We're going to get into an interesting concept on that. Now, here's some examples how these slaves were treated like prize animals. They fattened them up for sale. They would feed them and force them to eat so that they would look bigger, stronger, so they would bring a bigger price. The prices I gave you are approximate. When you go to an auction, you might buy one cow because it looks better than the other, or a car because it's nicer than the other. was no different than slaves. I gave you kind of a general. So they would actually fatten up slaves for sale. Now, what would they do with an old fart like me that was a slave? What would they do to help me out, to make somebody pay more for me? What might they do with me as I look today? I'm pretty fattened up already, so that would...
Make you work out.
Well, what?
You grow hair.
Well, you can't get blood out of a turnip. But what might they do to my hair to make me look younger? Color it. They would dye the hair of older slaves to hide the gray. Because nobody knew how old these slaves were. These slaves didn't have birth certificates. Nobody said this slave is 23 years old. Nobody had a clue. But you could certainly tell a slave was older if they had gray hair, right? Or no hair, thank you very much. Okay, so they covered those things up so they would sell more. Yeah.
Didn't they also oil them up with with fat, with lard to make them look?
I remember you
Like,
saying
you
something
said
about
that.
that.
Like they would oil them up in
Like
lard
on
and
shift
they
or
thought that
something?
they would
I don't remember that
To
one.
make it shine.
Well, they might be, bodybuilders, they
I
oil
remember
all up.
saying something that was like on ships or something.
Well, they
talking about it.
certainly could have, yeah, anything to make,
That what it
you know,
was?
do you wax your car, Cole? If you're
Yeah.
gonna sell it, you wax it up and clean it up, because it might sell for more than if it looks like a pigsty.
Brad was saying we read something like that in
They certainly could have. That's a perfect example. Now, this is in New Orleans. Now, this is kind of off the cuff, but it's true. A lot of these slaves were checked out. They'd look at their teeth and they'd look at, their physique, and they would see if they had scars on their backs or not. If they had scars on their backs, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? Why? That's exactly right. They would look at them. If they had scars on their back, that means they had been whipped and probably would bring a lower price because they were rebellious rather than non. Now, this is a little personal, I guess. The female slaves that brought the most money were light-skinned and what? Unbred, virgins, because they were going to use those women for breeding purposes. Okay? So the light-skinned, young, just saying it, virgin slave went for more money than a dark-skinned, non-virgin. It was like trading horses. It was like trading cattle, buying cars. It was amazing because these people are human beings, but yet they're treated like this in the slave trade. It's just crazy. Now, because these slaves were worth so much, even free black men were kidnapped and taken to New Orleans and sold as slaves. If you were black-skinned, you were not safe in 1840. Even if you were a free black from the north and you wandered down into the south, the chances are pretty good they would kidnap you, take you to New Orleans and sell you as a slave. And as you yelled, "I'm a free man, I'm a free man, I'm a free man," who cared? Nobody. Nobody cared. You were black. And if you're black, I can make money off of you. So even free blacks were kidnapped, taken to New Orleans, and sold as slaves. Now I'm going to get back to kind of what Willow was talking about in a way. Picture yourself at a slave auction. Here's mom, here's dad, here's 3 children. When they sell those slaves, do they care? So dad goes here, and mom goes here, the oldest child goes here, and the middle child goes here, and the youngest child goes here. Can you imagine that? Now, the Nelson family, a large family, right? Now this is way off base, but picture emotionally, if all of a sudden your family are slaves, and you go to auction, and all of a sudden your dad goes to one part of the country, your mom goes to the other, your sister, I mean, wouldn't that be just devastating? It would be devastating. And that's what they did to these people. I mean, it's just unbelievable. They had a law in Louisiana that you could not separate a child under the age of 11 from its mother. But more than 50% of the times, they didn't pay any attention. So there was a law that says if you're under the age of 11, you had to stay with your mom if you were sold. How often did that really get, anybody there to enforce that? No. It had to be a conscience deal. You had to have a conscience. And you know what? This talks and conscience walks. You know what I mean? It didn't happen very often. Now, what would be the only protest a slave could have prior to auction that might help their cause? That nobody would want to buy?
They were sick.
Or if they were skinny. So you know what slaves did to protest the way they were treated? They refused to eat. They would refuse to eat. Can't get heavier if you don't eat, right? You know what owners did when a slave refused to eat? Knocked out their teeth, stuck a funnel down their mouth, and force fed them. True story. So when these Negro slaves would refuse to eat, their owners would knock out their teeth and feed them through a funnel. True story. Can you imagine that? Yep.
I would just right?
It just would make you sick to your stomach. That's what they did. Knocked out their front teeth and fed them through a funnel. Now, if you were waiting to be auctioned off and you were treated so poorly, what might you do before you could be sold? What would you try to do? Run away. And many did. Many tried to run away. And some were caught, and some probably got away. More caught than got away. But here are the consequences you could expect to face if you were a runaway slave and got caught. Here are some of the consequences you could expect to receive. Would they do? Would they break your legs or break your arms? Why wouldn't they do that? Because you can't work, right? So usually, if you came back, runaway slave, and got caught, first thing they do is cut your ears off. That'll teach you a lesson. Does that hurt your workforce at all? Does that mean you can't hear? No, you just don't have any ears. They cut your ears off. That's one thing you could guarantee would more than likely happen to a runaway slave once they were caught out of New Orleans, is they'd cut your ears off. You know what else they might do to you? You could still work, but you couldn't run. Cut your Achilles tendon. Yeah, sever your Achilles tendon. You could stand and work, but you couldn't run very good, could you?
Yeah.
Achilles, very good. A-C-H-I-L-L-E-S. A-C-H-I-L-L-E-S. Can you imagine that? And then, to make sure everybody knew that you ran away and you might be a risk, what might they do to make sure everybody knew that you ran away at one time? Branded you. Would brand you. So you really had to decide whether it was worth it to run away and possibly get caught. Now, this is a great story. You probably heard of this person. One very famous Negro who chose to try to escape slavery and was successful was Frederick Douglass, who's on your ID sheet. Frederick Douglass. This is where he started ID. Frederick Douglass. He was a runaway slave who was successful. Successful. What he did is he ran away and he got on a train in Baltimore, Maryland. He ran away and got on a train in Baltimore, Maryland, hoping that that train would carry him to freedom forever. Now, when you got on the train, if you were a black man or woman, I guess, or child, what would they ask you for to make sure that you weren't a runaway slave?
Papers.
Papers. They'd ask you for your papers, your identification papers that would prove that you were indeed free. And you know who asked you for that on a train? The conductor. Like, instead of asking you for your ticket, he asked you for your papers. Now, how do I, if you get pulled over by the police in Billings, they don't know you, what's the first thing they ask for? And like, why do they ask you for the driver's license? Because the first thing they're going to do is do what? They're going to look at you and they're going to look at the driver's license to see if it's the same person. how good a photography did they have in the 1840s? Not very good. So what Frederick Douglass did is he presented another person's identification papers to the conductor. He borrowed them from a friend. And he didn't think it would hold up to careful examination because he really didn't look too much like the guy he borrowed them from. And it's going to have your height and your weight and the color, you know, all these things on a driver's license, right? I saw something on Facebook yesterday where some guy got put in jail because he forged a driver's license, and he was so dumb he and his girlfriend, he took a selfie of he and his girlfriend, and that was the picture on the license.
I saw that on
Did you?
Facebook.
Yeah, most people, I don't know if this is true, but if you do a fake ID, don't put your girlfriend on with you. It just pretty much gives it away.
It's just you.
Yeah, but anyway, Douglass feared he would be discovered as the papers he borrowed from a friend might not hold up to careful examination. Well, the train's conductor was in kind of a hurry. He didn't really look at the identification papers very carefully, and this allowed Frederick Douglass to board his way to freedom. The guy did not take a look at his identification papers very closely. Well, he left, got off that train, and escaped to New York City and became the face of the anti-slavery movement. He escapes to New York City and later becomes the face of the anti-slavery movement. Now, he became the first leader of the civil rights movement that early. Who became the most famous leader of the civil rights movement? Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1950s and 60s prior to his assassination. So Frederick Douglass was really the first civil rights leader in the United States. The more famous one you've heard of would be Martin Luther King Jr., who led the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. Ironically, we just talked about him today in our senior class. Another anti-slavery advocate, or someone that was against slavery, was Harriet Tubman. Anybody know what she has to do with Andrew Jackson? Go ahead.
Wasn't she the one that helped Indians off the Trail of Tears?
No, Harriet Tubman wasn't, no. She's going to develop what we call an underground railroad.
Yeah.
But what does she have to do with Andrew Jackson? Anybody know Harriet Tubman? Yeah? What's she have to do with Andrew Jackson?
Wasn't she his slave and he
No.
gave her freedom?
Who's on the $20 bill?
Oh, Jackson.
Andrew Jackson. Guess who's going to be on the $20 bill when the date
Harriet
change?
Tubman.
Harriet Tubman. Anyway, that was the choice was made. Anyway, what Harriet Tubman's known for was creating what we know as the Underground Railroad. Anybody want to guess what that was? It really wasn't what it says it was. Yeah. What was it?
It was a way of transporting slaves.
Yeah, it was a way to get. It was a way to get slaves escaping slavery. She escaped slavery and could have never done a thing, but she committed herself to risk everything and come back to the South to try to help others to escape. And they estimated that approximately 60,000 slaves escaped during the Underground Railroad during her time of initiating that. She dedicated her life, William, to going back to the South, which was incredibly risky as a black woman, and helping everyone else, so to speak, other Negroes, escape through what we call the Underground Road. And it was estimated that about 60,000 escaped. Now, let's take 60,000 times 1,000. How much is that? What's 60,000 times 1,000? 6 million. What should be about 50 million in today's dollars is what she caused the South to lose during her efforts. 60,000 slaves, and it was about $50 million that they lost. 50 million that they lost as a result of her efforts. Yep. Now here's a quick one for you. The South was so mad at her, they put a $40,000 reward on her head, dead or alive. You know what that'd be worth today? $1.11 million. Put $1 million bounty in today's money on her head. Okay, so she was so disliked by the South because of the money she was costing them in the slave trade. They put a $1.11 million bounty in today's money on her head.
That's pretty desperate.
Well, they were that mad.
I mean, they're gonna lose more money or something.
You ever heard of Rosa Parks? What did Rosa Parks do?
She refused to move.
She, in the 1950s, the law this was the law. They were called Jim Crow laws. Here's some examples of Jim Crow laws right here. Colored entrance only, drinking fountain, white, colored. Those are examples of legal Jim Crow laws. It was legal to segregate drinking fountains, entrances, restaurants, hotels, etc. It was legal to do that in the 60s. Well, what Rosa Parks did is, in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s, if you were a black person, you had to sit in the back of the bus. And if you sat in the back of the bus and the bus was full and a white person came up and said, "Listen, William, I want that seat," by law, you had to give that seat to the white person. Well, she said she got tired of that, so she wouldn't do it, got arrested, got fined, and really led to the Montgomery bus boycott in the 50s, led by Martin Luther King Jr., that gave him his start as a civil rights leader in this country in the 60s, 50s, and 60s. Here's the ironic thing. Harriet Tubman died 28 days after Rosa Parks was born. That's how long she lived. Think about that. So ironically, Harriet Tubman dies just 28 days after Rosa Parks was born. Two women that helped the Negro cause in way different generations. Kind of an interesting thing.